Okay, so I'm not a professional. This is not gonna look great. And I'm probably just gonna read from my notes that I've been taking and just like organizing. But anyways, I did the third question when it talks about the concept of election and holiness. And the original question said like how to what end does Yahweh choose Abraham and his descendants kind of thing. But essentially like the route I took was like to what end does Yahweh choose Abraham to be the father of all nations? Like, why did he choose him? Because that was the kind of the original question that I had in class. So, when I looked into election and holiness initially, I was just thinking on my own definition in my head and like, oh, how can that relate to like a biblical term, mostly election? And so I was like, okay, election is like appointing somebody to do something. And through a biblical lens, it almost seemed like really impersonal. Like, yeah, God's choosing this person, probably because they're qualified. And it just sounded like I'm electing you. I don't know. I just thought of like the presidency and how it's just like they choose them because they're more fit to do their job, essentially. As for holiness, I think of just like purity, I suppose, sanctification. It's already a biblical term, so I don't really have to think too hard on the definition of that. But when I looked into some Bible dictionaries, I used Erdman's and Easton's dictionary on my accordance. So like I went into Easton's, and so basically the definition is looking more like election equals honor, election equals privilege. Like God elected Abraham, God elected the nation of Israel. He elects people into his kingdom like through salvation. And Erdman's, it says election is more of a choosing of. And I found a Hebrew word for that. It's a ekligomai, which is used in the Old Testament. What's really cool about this dictionary is it said, and part of its definition was the source, or this is what I said in my thing, the source also says divine election demands obedience. Abraham obeyed. So like in God electing Abraham, he was like, you are going to obey me. Thankfully, Abraham did it willingly because he did obey God when he initially had called him. Now to switch it on to holiness. For Easton's Bible Dictionary, it said that holiness means belonging to God. There's also a form of personal holiness that is a work of gradual development, and I'll get to that in a second. In the Erdman's Dictionary, holiness is described as one of God's greatest attributes. So, and then it gave like, well, obviously God can't become less holy because he's God, so we have to become more holy. And then that kind of goes into the personal holiness, is like where you work towards that and you gradually become holy. Not that we're going to achieve perfection or anything, but if we want to be more like God, we have to become more holy, and the ways that we can do that is like through obedience, through faith, just like chasing after, and through the Holy Spirit, like getting those characteristics of God. Belonging to God, especially when chosen in the election sense, you must essentially follow his commandments and grow in character and grow in obedience, and that's kind of what I just said, I suppose. As we continue to think about Abraham, God elected him to become the first, like the start of the nations, like he's the father of all the nations, and the beginning of the line that ends with Jesus. Abraham was not necessarily holy. He was just a man that God chose for a task, but also chose him to belong to himself, and like he made a covenant with him. He's in the family. He's good. Jumping to the New Testament really quick, in Romans 4, we see kind of the one verse reflection of Abraham's life. In verses 1 and 3, it says that God counted Abraham's life as righteous because he believed. And then I kind of dabbled into righteousness, like where's the definition for that? So I actually went to Webster's, and it says that essentially like righteousness equals holiness. They're almost one and the same. Righteousness comprehends holy principles, affections of the heart, as well as the conformity of life in the divine law. All makes sense. With the covenant and growing in holiness and just reflections of your heart, where you're at. So we see that Abraham was counted holy because of his belief and his faith in God. Anyways, Abraham was chosen by God. He believed he was holy and righteous due to that faith. I also went into the Tyndale Bible Commentary and read the section about Romans by F.F. Bruce. It says, in quotes, Abraham accordingly is the true father of all who, like him, believe in God and take him at his word. He is the father of the uncircumcised believers, for he was himself uncircumcised when his faith was reckoned to him for righteousness. He is the father of the circumcised believers too, not so much on the ground of their circumcision as on the ground of their faith. And so this is where I'm starting to answer that second half of the question. I did kind of like a comparison of election and holiness, but now like why Abraham? And this kind of just did it for me. I realized I was like, wow, okay, Abraham, he was chosen and he was uncircumcised. So I read it, I don't know if it was in the same commentary, but essentially he was probably a pagan, so what better choose someone who already wasn't in the faith, kind of like the Gentiles looking forward, like what a representation of that, including both Gentiles and Jews into the family. He was the father of the uncircumcised because he himself was uncircumcised, but he was also obedient to God, and in his faith he obeyed and then became circumcised and followed God and his parameters, his rules and stuff. Another comment in this commentary section was the concept of Abraham's faith was counted as righteous, but it didn't just apply to Abraham, it actually carried on. So the fact that he was like A1, day one, sorry for my language, he was like the first one, but that because of the covenant and because he was the father of a multitude of nations, like that's going to carry on. His one act of obedience was like the driving force. And now I'm going to also upload my little script I'm going off, but this is what I wrote. It was like, so basically, Abraham was a perfect example of the grace of God and the goodness of God. One, looking at history, like I said, he was probably a pagan before obeying God's call, but he did listen. I said, with that being said, he was uncircumcised, but he had faith, and that was important rather than the physical sign of his commitment. So like even before like following those rules and those laws, before the laws, I suppose, he was like committed. He was obedient, and so through the obedience, like I said, he did end up getting circumcised as representing the two. Genesis 17:11 says this. It says, you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. And so that that obedience, that covenant driving force, it made sense. This is all that clicked in my mind. It made sense to me that Abraham was the father of all nations because he could relate to the faith of both the Gentiles and the Jews, and I kind of said that before. Genesis 17:5, backing up a little bit. You shall, it says, your name shall no longer be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham, because I have made you the father of a multitude of nations, and that's kind of my whole thing. Kind of to end it, election doesn't necessarily mean that you are already holy, but through God's appointing of you and choosing of you, you can be made holy, or at least have the standards now to abide by, to become holy, that personal holiness that you're working gradually towards. Let's see. Abraham was the perfect example for those who are to become believers. He wasn't anything special, but God saw an opportunity to use an ordinary pagan to transform into a holy, righteous man, giving him the opportunity to be obedient, to have faith. That's what I said. All God did was give him one opportunity of obedience and faith. I think that through this choice and election of Abraham, God is glorified all the more because God moves through the simple things and the simple people. And through the scriptures, we clearly see that. So I hope that answers the question. I learned a lot from this in regards to the two. I feel like without election, you can't, now I'm going off a tangent. Without election, you can't really become holy because it's the choosing of you by God. And God's always going to choose you because he wants to be with his creation. He wants to be holy with what was supposed to be initially holy people as well. So yeah, and then I chose to do an art piece, and so I kind of just sketched this up. This is what originally, when I read this question and understood it, this is what I thought in my mind. It was just like an intimate moment with God and Abraham, or just anybody, I suppose. It's just like God holding you and being like, I'm choosing you, and because I'm choosing you, you're holy to me. And then I also wrote a little scripture, was Genesis 17:5. But your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I feel like that was the initial, I'm like choosing you for this task. And so this is my art piece. It's God's hand and Abraham sitting in it intimately, like this holy God, one we picture like off in the distance on the skies, like reaching out and just having this intimate moment of like, you're not anything special to other people, but you're special to me, and I'm choosing you for this, and this is a huge thing, and you should feel honored. And I think Abraham did. I think he did feel honored because he was counted as righteous, and I think like he was justified before that, I guess, was even a known concept. I think of justification like way off in the New Testament, but this right here. So that is all. Thank you, Dr. Espinoza. I'm sorry for my long, awful video presentation. It is just me ranting.